Thank you very much. Now, is the United Nations the institution upon which the world's future depends, or is it an instrument of an embryonic socialist tyranny? There are a few questions that are more important for those who understand and cherish freedom. And in this 50th anniversary year of the United Nations, many of the world's most powerful and influential leaders are urging the people of the world to support measures which would give the United Nations every necessary attribute of a fully functioning world government. This is not a new idea. For over 250 years, there have been elites who have pursued the vision of a world under the direction of an elite group which would regiment our lives and seek to dictate to us the way in which we will live. This was the vision we saw in the French Revolution. It is the vision we saw in the Russian Revolution in 1917. And now the United Nations is the inheritor of this objective. And these ideas have been reiterated in this new book, Our Global Neighborhood, which is a recent report composed by the Commission on Global Governance, which is an organization which was founded with the blessing of Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations. This report recommends that the UN be given the power to impose taxes, that it be equipped with a battle-ready military under its exclusive control, and that it give the World Court compulsory jurisdiction over individuals. They also urge that the United Nations support the creation of a world central bank, and that they campaign to disarm the entire world, including the civilian population. Now, once again, none of these recommendations are new, and most of them have been made at some point during the last 50 years by the United Nations and by the United States government. However, what is new is the brazenness with which the UN and its supporters have called for the creation of a fully functioning world government under the United Nations administration. Now, what are the implications of such a development for you and your families? To answer this question, it must first be understood that the United Nations embodies not only a political philosophy, but a religious vision as well. That political philosophy is globalism, the concept that human evolution will be consummated in the development of a global government based on socialist principles. Now, this is the malignant objective which we find within the UN's assurances that the organization seeks universal peace. The most candid admission of this often concealed objective was made in 1970 by then UN Secretary General U Thant. He praised Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet government, as an apostle of world peace, whose ideas, quote, have had a profound influence on the course of contemporary history, a profound and bloody influence on the course of contemporary history, I might add. Now, according to U Thant, quote, Lenin's ideals of peace and peaceful coexistence among states are in line with the aims of the UN Charter. Like every other UN Secretary General, U Thant was a socialist, and he surely understood that Lenin's concept of peaceful coexistence did not embrace the sovereignty of nations and individual rights, but rather the triumph of socialism. It is this vision of peace, that is the tranquility of servitude, not the triumph of freedom, which inspires the United Nations efforts. Now, the United Nations religious vision could be summarized as the idea of the state as God, that is, the state as the creator of our rights and the provider of all our material benefits and the source of our literal salvation. And perhaps the most detailed exposition of this perspective, this religious perspective, was offered by former Assistant Secretary General Robert Mueller, whose New Age scribblings are regarded as something akin to sacred scripture by many within the United Nations system. Mueller has written that, quote, I have come to believe that our future, peace, justice, and fulfillment, happiness, and harmony on this planet will not depend on world government, but on divine or cosmic government. And the seat of this divine government, according to Robert Mueller, would be the UN. Mueller has written that the organization represents what he calls the body of Christ. And he has insisted that, quote, if Christ came back to earth, his first visit would be to the United Nations to see if his dream of human oneness and brotherhood had come true. Now, is Christ's teachings about human oneness and brotherhood in any way compatible with Lenin's vision of human oneness? Now, it would have to be if Mueller's statement were correct, and traditional Christians know better than that. Now, one symbolic manifestation of the UN's vision of cosmic government can be found in the meditation room of the United Nations, which is depicted on the cover of my book. This room was designed in 1952 by then Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, a Swedish socialist and homosexual, and it has been maintained by an organization called the Lucis Trust. It was under Hammarskjöld's leadership, incidentally, that the UN conducted its murderous suppression of the province of Katanga in the former Belgian Congo in the early 1960s. When Katanga sought to obtain its independence from the communist rule of Congolese dictator Patrice Lumumba, the United Nations so-called peacekeeping troops conducted a campaign of slaughter, pillage, and rape against the province.
UN troops advancing from all sides systematically wipe out all resistance pockets, and in the process machine gun and bazooka civilian cars trying to escape from the city, killing many innocent civilians running for their lives to find cover from UN fire. This truck, which had made an attempt to carry refugees, among them women and children, out of Elizabethville, was deliberately bazookaed by UN Ethiopian troops. Many of the slain men and women were civilians who bore no arms. A sworn statement by 46 doctors at the scene characterizes as murder the action of UN troops in machine gunning civilians and Red Cross ambulances.
The peacekeeping operation conducted against the Congo, by the way, is still proudly listed as among the UN's most conspicuous successes, and Dag Hammarskjöld is elevated by the United Nations as the very model of an effective Secretary General. The massacre of the Congo was what we could consider to be a particularly vigorous application of the UN's vision of world brotherhood. Now, the Lucis Trust, which has helped to maintain the meditation room, is an outgrowth of a previous organization called the Lucifer Publishing Company. That publishing company was itself a descendant of the Theosophical Society. The objective of the Theosophical Society, which was founded in the late 19th century, was to destroy monotheistic faith, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and replace it with the new world religion under which humanity would be directed by leaders who are attuned to an unseen brotherhood of ascended masters who supposedly preside over human evolution. In her book, The Secret Doctrine, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the Russian mystic who was the founder of the Theosophical Society, identified these so-called Lords of Wisdom as none other than Satan and his host. Now, the Lucis Trust, which is the vessel of Blavatsky's satanic religion, helped create not only the meditation room of the United Nations, but also the UN so-called Temple of Understanding. Lucis eagerly distributes Robert Mueller's writings as well, and helps to organize religious support for the UN's initiatives, and they are a conspicuous presence at every United Nations World Summit. Now, Mueller has called for what he refers to as an alliance between all major religions and the UN, and since 1991, the UN has undertaken several significant steps toward the formal creation of this envisioned religious alliance. During a 1991 Paris meeting of the United Nations Educational, Cultural, and Scientific Organization, also known as UNESCO, globalist theologian Hans Kung offered to compose on the UN's behalf what was referred to as the religious equivalent of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UN Charter, a global ethic document which would contain a binding summary of rights and responsibilities for religious people all around the world. The completed document was presented to the 1993 Parliament of World Religions in Chicago, and it was referred to in that meeting as, quote, an alternative framework for religion to which people would be held accountable. Now, incidentally, the first Parliament of World Religions in 1893, which was also held in Chicago, offered Blavatsky's Theosophical Society its first significant access to American culture. And the 1993 Parliament was hailed by contemporary theosophists as the herald of a great theosophical revival. Now, the text of the Declaration of a Global Ethic declares that the document represents, quote, an irrevocable, unconditional norm for all areas of life, for families and communities, for races, nations, and religions. And acceptance of this universal norm, according to the global ethic document, will be a minimum requirement to be considered authentically human in the 21st century. Now, significantly, the word God is not found anywhere in this document. And the commandments contained therein issue from individuals who presume to speak on behalf of a different deity, namely the sacred earth, or Gaia, our earth mother. Apparently, authentic humans will have no use for property rights in the 21st century. The global ethic states that, quote, no one has the right to use her or his possessions without concern for the needs of society and earth. Individualism as well is condemned as a sin. The document asserts that, quote, self-determination and self-realization are legitimate as long as they are not separated from human self-responsibility and global responsibility, that is, responsibility for fellow humans and for the planet Earth. The Global Ethic Declaration commands journalists, political officials, and religious leaders to promote this Ghazi collectivism as a moral imperative for everybody on the planet Earth. Now, what impact will this UNESCO-supported and UN-promoted global ethic have on practitioners of traditional biblical religion? Well, consider this statement from Hans Kung, who was the author of the document. In 1991, he wrote, quote, any form of church conservatism is to be rejected. To put it bluntly, no repressive or regressive religion, whether Christian, Islamic, Jewish, or of whatever provenance, has a long-term future. In other words, traditional monotheistic faiths must now yield before the imperatives of the global ethic, according to Kung and his comrades. And incidentally, the phrase authentically human should send a chill through anybody who was acquainted with the history of this bloody century, what has been the common fate of those who have been designated as something other than authentically human. We have seen what has happened to such people in the killing fields of Cambodia and in the Soviet Revolution and in the chambers of Auschwitz. This is the same philosophy once again. The keynote address of the 1993 Parliament of World Religions was given by Gerald Barney of the Millennium Institute. He is a former program director for the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the primary author of the Global 2000 report for the Carter administration. Mr. Barney was the chief organizer of the Religious Parliament, and his revised edition of the Global 2000 report, called Global 2000 Revisited, was the primary text for the 1993 Parliament of World Religions. Barney told the assembled religious leaders that, quote, an internationally famous, highly influential author on sustainable development, that is, environmentalism, told me bluntly, religion must die. It is the fundamental cause of virtually all social, economic, and ecological problems and much of the violence in the world. The only alternative to the destruction of religion, Barney told the assembled religious leaders, is the creation of an ecologically correct universal religion, one which would sustain the political and social objectives identified by the United Nations, particularly with respect to population control. This point has also been made by Maurice Strong, who is a Canadian industrial mogul and New Age adept, who served as the Secretary General of the United Nations 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. At that meeting, the United Nations created a mammoth blueprint for ecologically correct world government called Agenda 21, whose directives, according to Agenda 21, quote, are to be implemented by every person on Earth. Once again, this is depicted by the United Nations as something in the nature of a religious obligation. At the Rio Earth Summit, Maurice Strong declared that, quote, the responsibility of each human being today is to choose between the force of darkness and the force of light. We must therefore transform our attitudes and values and adopt a renewed respect for the superior laws of divine nature. Maurice Strong is presently collaborating with former Soviet dictator Mikhail Gorbachev in the creation of an Earth Charter, a definitive statement of these so-called laws of divine nature. Now, according to Gorbachev, the Earth Charter will be, quote, a 10 commandments for the environment, something that no one will be allowed to violate. Now, this is not the language of biblical morality.